Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual domestic violence symposium. And it is appropriately named Cycles of Trauma. I mean, we're all aware of the fact that we go through trauma in so many ways, but unfortunately, we close our eyes too many times when it comes to domestic violence. Now, I have a little saying for that is that this is really domestic terrorism mislabeled as domestic violence. Because when we talk domestic violence, what we do not ever think about is the fact that we talk about being patriots and protecting our home and how proud we are of the flag and that kind of thing. However, when it comes to our personal homes and we are not protecting those that are within those walls, then it becomes a place of terror. So, as we talk today, we will be sharing with none other than Mr. Ricky Houston, who's the training director for A Call to Men, a national organization most to help to eradicate and to help to educate us as to the devastation of domestic violence. Now, along with Mr. Houston being our keynoter, we also have Mr. Shatranjan Greer, who is a young man that will be sharing with you about his understanding of the process, if I might call it that. We have a late guest, two late guests that'll be coming in with us in the person of Dr. Latienda Pierre Davis. She'll be sharing her bit with you as well, and a couple doctors and retired pastors, Charles and Sharon Burton. We want to again thank you for joining us as we work with cycles of trauma. We are going to be in conversation, and we like to share anytime we do any kind of show with any audience that we do conversations. We don't tell people this is what you should do, that's what you can't do. We do conversations. So we will ask that you respect the fact that this is a conversation. If there are things that you may agree or disagree with, that's fine. However, please understand this is a conversation. Mr. Houston is an expert. Nobody Asked Me Guys show, along with Brighter Futures Incorporated, is bringing this broadcast to you this evening with the blessings, and allow me to say this, with the blessings of A Call to Men. Brother Ricky Houston, how are you today, sir?
Doing well, Brother Lois. Great to be with you today.
Well, listen, the pleasure is all ours. And I initially started, Brother Houston, to tell our guest a little bit about you, sir. But will you bless us with some information relative to Ricky Houston?
Yes, I'm Ricky Houston, Director of Training for A Call to Men. I've actually been doing violence prevention work, gender-based violence prevention for almost 20 years now, and just really understand the importance and the value of men, engaging men. When we look at men's violence against women, if women could have ended the violence, our co-founder, Tony Porter, have said so many times that if women could have ended the violence, they would have done it a long time ago. And so I realized the importance of men engaging other men and using our voice and our influence and our platform, because that's how we're going to eradicate the violence. And so based here, I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina, where I raised my family, 2 adult children now. But I just see it as my life calling around ending violence against women.
Mr. Houston, take it away, sir.
All right, thank you, Brother Laws. It's great to be with you. And as I said earlier, that when we look at ending men's violence against women, I love how we call it domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But I love what you said. It's it's when you label it terrorism. I've had the opportunity to do some work in West Africa, and while I was there, spoke with a gentleman who the country was out of civil war for about 7 years, and he had been part of this program, and really there was such a change in his life that one of the highest forms of gratitude that you could show was in the form of a live chicken, and his wife brought a live chicken to the group, and we asked him, say, what was it that made you want to change? And he said, I realized how the Civil War had destroyed my country. And then I was doing that same, I was destroying my home. I was perpetrating that same violence in my home. So he realized that. So when you use that word terrorism, that's so impactful. And one of the questions that I would ask while I was there was, do you have that problem in your country? And there I'm speaking in a different country, but we have that same huge problem right here in the United States. And so when we look at it, the importance of this conversation today, as I said, what Tony said some years ago, if women could have ended the violence, they would have done it a long time ago. And so that's the role of A Call to Men. we're engaging men to end men's violence against women. We're working alongside of women, but we know that, that it's men's work. That's men's work. We've got to understand, where this violence comes from, but not only that, but what's our role in ending the violence. Not only ending the violence, but also preventing future violence. I can remember some years ago doing prevention work for domestic violence shelter here in my city. And one morning, this family, his mom came in with her two sons, and one of the advocates came out to get the mom, and the older brother, probably about 9, 10 years old, he was there, and he was being, for his little brother, and his mom said, "I'll be right back." And before the youth advocate, could arrive, as soon as mom left, the older brother grabbed his little brother's hand and just really broke down crying. And I thought about that. I said, there he is. He's trying to be tough, trying to be strong, all these things, in the man box that we talk about, but he breaks down crying. And what I did, I kneeled down, and so many things are happening in my head. And, and the question that I asked myself, what is my role? What is my role? And I think that's the question so many of us men that we need to ask. What is my role to end men's violence against women? But also, what is my role to prevent men's violence against women? And I still so often, as I do the work that I do, I think about that little boy, because what we do know that 80% of abusers grew up in homes where abuse was present. Now, we know that many things can be, true at once. That doesn't mean that you're going to be an abuser, but because that's how you've been socialized. That's because how you've seen things. And sometimes we kind of normalize that this boy, he could very well later on in life become an abuser. Or he can see how that the violence, how it is destroying his home, and does not become that young man. But the big thing we have to talk about is growing up in that home of domestic violence, trauma, as you talked about earlier, as we deal with that. That's very traumatic when you're seeing that type of abuse. That's very traumatic. And the next thing of it is too, when we think about our male socialization, a term that we've coined, a phrase that we've coined at a call to men is called the man box. And what the man box is that with us, if we were just a group of guys sitting around talking, we talk about, we've got a box, a bunch of ingredients of what society says it means to be a man. But in a more professional, intellectual term, we call it the collective socialization of manhood. And what that is, society tells us there's so many things. And when I say this, these are things that are not written in a book anywhere. You can't find them in a book. But we've been socialized that, hey, that big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. And you think about what age we start hearing that big boys don't cry. 2 and 3 years old, we're talking about, big boys don't cry, especially before 5 years old, before the time you get on the school bus, because, you need to dry that up. You don't go out of this house crying. Also is that you have to be tough. You have to be strong. And so as men, now whether we act on these things or not, we know these things. And so when we think about, being strong, we've been taught, that definition based, solely upon muscle. But now if we take it away from muscle and we begin to talk about, a definition of strength based outside of muscle, then as we think about that, and Brother Law, I love the picture you have in the background, with your mother there, because as we think about strength, there's more times than none that the strong people we think about in our lives oftentimes are women. We think about our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts, some very strong women when we lean into that definition outside of muscle. Also with that man box, always having to be tough, always having to be strong. And so all those things are very traumatic. And one of the things that we do is how we define manhood too often is how we distance ourselves from the experiences of women and girls. So we teach boys at a very early age that if there's a video I show sometime of this little boy, he's about 2, maybe 3 years old, who's getting his vaccination. He's got to get 3 shots. And, and his dad is there with him, and the nurse practitioner is there, and, and his dad is telling him, hey, this, they're big boy now. And all of a sudden he get his first shot. And his dad tell him, be strong, be strong. And the little boy, his face breaks. And he gets the second shot, and he starts to cry. And his dad is telling him, big boys don't cry, big boys don't cry, be tough. And all of a sudden he gets the third shot. And, and he's crying. His dad said, oh, big boys don't cry, be tough. And the nurse is saying, big boy, oh, you made it. And so when we look at this, Then his dad tell him, say I'm a man. Say I'm a man. And this little boy with a little bass in his voice at 2, maybe 3 years old, say, I'm a man. Now, here's the whole thing. You know, this boy is not a man. He's still a little boy. Did he feel pain? Now, 2, 3 years old, cognitively, this is all he has, is that when he's happy, he smiles. When he's sad, he's frowns. When he hurts, he cries. But now all of a sudden is dad is telling this boy to shut down his emotions, really telling him not to feel. And so when we look at this collective socialization of manhood, think about how we shut down the emotions of boys at a very early age. Here's the caveat. And oftentimes when I'm doing trainings, this is something I kind of add in, is that what if this little boy would have had a twin sister and she was getting her vaccination next? You know, could she have cried? And it's always yes. How long could she have cried? As long as she wanted to. And the thing of that is that dad would have probably prepared her and said, hey, you're going to get a shot and just going to cry, but don't worry about it. Dad is here. And so oftentimes we say women are nurturers. But you know what? Men, we're nurturers too, because what dad did with his daughter is nurturing. But oftentimes we don't nurture our sons. We coach our sons. You know, we talk about being tough. We tell them to shut down their emotions. And so at a very early age, we teach little boys to distance themselves from the experiences of women and girls. And so so when he goes off to school and he's got other little friends, all of a sudden girls are, ugh. And then, you know, later on when he gets to be about 12 or 13 years old, you know, he began to take interest in women and girls all over again. But often, you know, that interest is singular and it's always around sexual conquest. So look at the things that we're teaching our boys at a very early age that continue to perpetrate this men's violence against women. It really kind of sets the foundation. There are 3 things, 3 components that we like to talk about or call to men that really that sets the fertile ground to allow men's violence against women to exist. We talk about treating women with less value. So all of a sudden now, this boy, think about this little boy. He's there getting his vaccination, and his dad, you know, telling him not to cry. But if he sees his sister and she can cry, then all of a sudden, you know, all of a sudden what dad is saying is boys are tough, but girls are soft. Boys are strong, but girls are weak. And all these things. So what happened is he's beginning to devalue girls at a very early age. And so when we see this, you know, all this less value, and we see how it still shapes in our society today, even as we think about the amount of money on the dollar that women receive in the same job as men, as we think about, as we even look in society, when we're looking at politics, just now, you know, we're seeing women being represented. But for so often, you know, we had these gender roles for so long, how we really devalue women. So we begin to set that foundation at a very, very early age. The next thing about it is that another one of those components is property, how we viewed women as property as well. You know, the property of men. And you will hear guys say, oh, that's my girl, or either he's handling his business, that's his woman. And so we see it as property of men. And so that's that second component. And the third component of what I just said is about objectification, viewing women as objects, especially sexual objects. That's when I say, you know, all of a sudden beginning to take that interest again in girls, but it's always around sexual objectification or sexual gratification. So those are the things that we teach that really kind of is the fertile ground that allow men's violence against women to exist, that grows at a very early age. And so when we tell them boys, little boys that are very to be tough, be strong, or stop acting like a girl, you know, big boys don't cry. What we're doing is we're telling them not to feel. And so I look at that as as a role for men, because we know how to nurture. We know how to nurture. And in having these conversations, sometimes I have moms come to me and say, you know what, Rick, you know, I'm guilty of that as well. Of telling my son, be a big boy. Big boys don't cry. Not allowing him to share his emotions. And when we think about this, and I know you asked the question, what does this have to do with trauma? But when we look at this, as boys, when we have to shut down our feelings, and in that man box that we're told that, hey, that we don't ask for help, we don't offer help, and we don't accept help, because we always have to be in control, always have to be tough and strong. So when we look at that, and so we have that what we call limited emotional intelligence. So we're not even allowed to put, you know, words to how we're feeling. Because really as in this man box, the only emotion that we're allowed to show is anger. is anger. And what we do know is anger is not a primary emotion, it's a secondary emotion. Anger normally comes, anger normally comes from either I'm hurt about something, you hurt my feelings, I'm sad about something, I'm afraid about something. There's fear there. And so I'm disappointed about something. So when we look at that, that anger is that secondary emotion. But now it should transient, say something to hurt my feeling. I'm not allowed to tell him that, hey man, you hurt my feeling. Because what happened, Brother Laws, you may laugh at me, but I have permission to go and to get angry. I have permission, to kick a door or hit my fist through the wall. Because then we say, oh, that's just boys being boys. And so often is in order for me to stay in that man box, then those are the things that I'm allowed to say or allowed to do and not share those emotions. And those are the things that really keeps us. Because when we look at men, this man box, as we think about men's violence against women, we know that 1 in 4 relationships are impacted by domestic violence. And I said earlier, think about that little kid. 80% of abusers grew up in homes where abuse was present. So when I think about that, like I said, we know that's not a guarantee, because there's so many men say, hey, that will not be me. But when I look at that and that we're not allowed to show emotions and how we keep things bottled up, that we don't talk about things because we always have to show that we're in control. Always dominant. We're in control. And the sad thing about that is that I could be dealing with something. Brother Lars and I can go out and have dinner tonight, and just he and I sitting there, and I would never tell him what's going on in my life. I would never have that conversation because I want him to think, hey, that I'm tough, that I'm in control, that everything's okay. And the truth of the matter is that you may have dealt with something that I'm going through right now. You could be there to really kind of help me walk through it, or even it may just make me feel better, just to kind of get it off my chest, just to have someone to talk to. So when we think about this limited emotional intelligence, we commit suicide 3.5 times more than women do, because women are socialized, to share their feelings of what's going on. We would do that. And dads, even with our sons, we have to really kind of put ourselves in check, because often with our sons, hey man, you good? And think about, how we had that conversation with other men. We look at our brothers, hey man, you good? And what we just did was gave him the answer in the question, because the expectation is, yeah, man, I'm good. And we can look at his face and we can look at his whole body language and tell that he's not good. But because we haven't been socialized how to handle that conversation, we don't want him to say anything. But yeah, I'm good. And so often, as we think about that, Tony Porter, our co-founder, says, I love how he just kind of packages. He said, our son can walk in the room and we say, hey, you good? And we can look at him and tell he's not good. Yeah, I'm good. You sure you're good? Yeah, I'm good. And boom, we're good with it. And our wives will say, hey, you talk with that boy? Yeah, he said he was good. Like, you need to talk. No, he said he was good. But mom will say, come here, what's going on with you? Mom, I'm good. What's going on with you? Sit down and tell me what's going on with you. Is that mom is not going to be so quick to let it go. And I think as men is that we've got to really learn how to check in with each other and also check in with our sons, because what I realized even as a dad, and even doing this work, that I have to do a better job of checking in on my son, because what we don't realize in this whole man box, because so often is that I was with a group of college students a couple of months ago, and we talked about this man box. And there was a couple of guys, well, I didn't grow up with this, and there were a couple of guys said, yeah, that was my whole life. He said, even though my dad taught us how to live outside of this man box, he said, but when he was with his friends, he portrayed something totally different. And so often is, it's not always about what we say, but it's more about what our actions are. And so what I realize is that, some of the things that my son saw in me, that I'm having to go back and have these conversations to reteach. Like, hey, son, that was not healthy. That was not healthy. And I realized that when at one time my son played ice hockey, and for a while I coached his hockey team, and never played hockey a day in my life, but I played sports. I understood the game, and they lost the championship game right in the last couple of seconds of the game. I did my coach's spiel afterwards, and after all the kids, I went over to my son and said, "You good?" And which was a dumb question, because hey, just lost the championship game in the last seconds. They were tied, and boom, team scored. And he said, "No, I feel like I said, want to cry." I said, "Yes." And I said, what's stopping you then? And what I realized in that moment was, what had I taught my son that he had to get permission from his dad to show his emotions, share his true feelings in order to cry? And what I noticed was I had to think back, when has my son ever, seen me cry? Only twice in his life. When I lost my father. And then 2 years later, I lost my niece, who was like 5 years younger than me. And so what he did was equated a man crying was with death of someone very close to you. And so we had to go back and have these conversations around, okay, there's nothing wrong with, sharing emotions. I just got this new app now about checking in about, about our mental health. And so I'm having conversations with him now, because for so often as men, we looked at, even when we're struggling, even in life, even with those traumatic situations, as I said earlier about kids growing up, in a home of domestic violence. I know this Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but think about, even when we think about sexual assault, think about men's violence against women. We think about girls between the age of 16 and 24, 14 and 24. One in five would be sexual assaulted. Think about 1 in 6 altogether. But nobody ever talks about that number 1 in 7 around the boys, little boys ages up, 14. No one talk about the numbers as we think about trauma. And so you have a lot of men who are holding on to that, because in this whole man box that we don't talk about these things. And so that's why we've got to move to the place where we're telling our boys, to begin to have these conversations. I want to go back to another word I used earlier about distancing, about how little boys are taught to distance themselves, from the experiences of women and girls. And I asked the question earlier about what is our role, and I asked that question about myself. What is my role to make sure that that little boy that I kneeled down to talk to that morning, to let him know, hey, I couldn't promise him that it would never happen again. So what is my role to end men's violence against women? What is my role to prevent it? And so as I'm thinking about that and how little boys distance themselves, how we teach them to distance themselves from the experience of women and girls, I have to think about us as adult men. If you go to a college campus, oftentimes I ask guys, do they have women's studies classes here on this campus? Yes. How many of you are enrolled? You may have 1 or 2 hands. And the reason that is that because, that lack of interest in the experiences of women and girls. If my outstretched hands represents all men, there's only a small amount of men who are abusive. But then there's the rest of us. Okay? There's the rest of us. And so what happens is that what we have to ask ourselves, the question, if this amount of guys was perpetrating all this violence, this 1 in 4 domestic violence, 1 in 5, 16 and 24 sexual assault, 1 in 6 altogether with rape. When we look at, 2 to 3 homicides per day, when we look at this amount of men, that's a lot of violence for this amount of men. But the reason that it exists, because then there's the rest of us. And what that means is that it's happening in our presence. Not meaning that we're there watching when it happens, is that we're aware that it's taking place. But the problem is that we've had distanced ourselves from it. And so we don't talk about it. We don't make it, something that's important to us. And so there are times in what I do, especially when I'm in a room with athletes, and let's say I have 100 athletes in the room, I'll invite 10 to come up to the front of the room with me and say, we're going to play tug of war. And I'll ask that small group, I say, hey, can we beat those guys? And a few of them like, yeah, we've got it. Some will look at me like I'm crazy. And then I asked the larger group, can we take on them? They're like, no. I said, why not? And they said, because numbers. So what do you mean by numbers? There's strength in numbers. I said, so what you're telling me is because there's strength in numbers, there's no way we can beat you guys. That's right. And so I said, okay, let's take this back and put it in, in the connotation of men's violence against women. And when we look at this, I said, my team up here, this small group, that small group right there, I said, we are the ones who are committing this 1 in 4, domestic violence, 1 in 4 relationships. I said, that's us perpetrating this violence. 2 to 3 homicides per day, that's us. The 1 in 5 sexual assault, that's us. I said, well, now what you're saying, because your numbers, there's strength in numbers. So if that's true, then what happened is, then if you come together, if you say no longer on my team, not on my campus, not in my faith community, not place, then that's how we can eradicate that. But the problem has been is that you have developed that lack of interest. You develop that lack of interest because the interest for me is, okay, I'm thinking about the women in my life. Short story right quick. I was doing some work for Major League Soccer. Was flying around the country doing training for them for preseason. And at that particular time, my daughter had just graduated from college. She was living in Charleston, South Carolina at the moment. And I flew in for LA the night before to be with the team the next day in Charleston. And I asked them, I said, how many of you, if you saw my daughter today, would respect her if you saw her? And they go, oh, yes, Mr. Houston, every hand went up. I said, but you don't know her. You wouldn't know what she looked like if you saw her. I said, so in order for that to happen, you would have to respect every woman that you came into contact with. You would have to respect every woman you came into contact with. So what that means is that you have to develop that interest. You have to develop that interest in the experience of women and girls. And so what I'm saying is that when I understand my role, when we think about the amount of violence that's taking place, and as men, when we begin to develop an interest of what's happening in the lives of women and girls, not just the women in our lives, because what I shared with those young men that day is that every woman out there is important to someone. They're valuable to someone. And so then what we need to see that is that when we begin to take that mindset and we begin to see our role, then that's when we begin to have these conversations. That's when we'll stop laughing at sexist jokes. But that's when we see our role and our responsibility. One of the big things is that I had an awesome experience last night. There's a youth football team that every year, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, is that I go out and the coaches invite me in to speak to their young players. And it's so great. And one of the things I do is that I speak to them on a level that they can understand. But I let them know because you're athletes, you have influence, and there are people at your school to look up to you. And so guess what? You set the stage. You set the tone. You build that culture that you want in your school. Build that culture that you want in your community. And so when we begin to do that, then that's how we begin to make a difference. So at a call to men, we really look at engaging men. And also engaging men of influence. When I'm working with professional athletes, college athletes, it's that same thing. I always encourage professional athletes, go back to your hometown, go back to your college. You're very influential. Use that platform, because when you speak up, that's how we can end men's violence against women. I was at a team one year, an NFL team, and I would not say the team or the player's name, but I was like, we need more of him. I finished their presentation, finished their workshop, and he walked back with me to the director of player engagement office and sat down and kept talking. And the director of player engagement looked at me and said, Rick, you might as well have a seat. And we spent another 45 minutes talking. But he finally told me, he said, the reason I'm asking you so many questions, he said, because when you leave, I want to continue to have this conversation in the locker room. And that's who we're looking for. That's who we're looking for. Because when we engage men, when we see our role, that's why I say so quickly early when Tony said if women could have ended the violence, they would have done it a long time ago. Well, that's why as men, we have guiding principles that are called to men that guide our work. And we talk about men's work. We talk about the work that we have to do. But something else, one of our guiding principles, the reason we do the work that we do, because we say there's hope for men. There's hope for men, because we know there are men like who are on this call today who are going to engage other men and really kind of see our role and see our responsibility. There's one other thing that I'm gonna stop talking for a minute so we can get everybody else in the conversation. But just want to, I always like to honor our co-founders, Tony Porter and Ted Bunch. But Ted always says, this is not an indictment on men, but we invite men to have a conversation. We like to meet men where they are. Because when I talked about earlier about that father taking his son to get his vaccination, you know what? Dad didn't see anything wrong with that. And that's how dad had been socialized. But now, once we begin to educate dad, then all of a sudden that shift began to take place. And all of a sudden, then dad teaches his son healthy manhood as well. And so, as I said earlier, as much as, in the men's violence against women, we know it's killing women and girls, but it's also killing us as men as well, as we think about our mental and emotional health. And also, that impacts our physical health as well. So there's so much work for us to do. And also, and it moved people to the place of dealing with our past traumas. Kids who grow up, with domestic violence, who have seen it firsthand, who have experienced it firsthand, to move to the place where we can move into healthy manhood, get in those resources, get in that counseling, that therapy, that they need in order that we can be our best selves. And so I really think that healthy manhood is the place where we can eradicate domestic and sexual violence.
Well, that's powerful. A whole lot said. Listen, allow me, Brother Houston, and our other panelists. We have now been blessed with the presence of our president of the Caddo Boja Domestic Violence Task Force in the person of Dr. Latienda Pierre Davis. And I hope you guys agree with me. I think it's a perfect segue to have our sister share with us at this time. Guys, I know you've been here a while waiting. I know you guys are fired and ready to go. But please allow me to speak to our president and to ask her to share with us who she is, and she'll jump right in.
Right. Well, hello everybody. How you doing? I apologize for my tardiness. There was a prior meeting that kind of went over, but I am so happy to be on here and among some great gentlemen, getting a chance to share a little bit. So my name is Dr. Latienda Pierre. I am the president of the Caddo Boja Domestic Violence Task Force, and so my task force that I am the leader of consists of about 42 members, represent various organization agencies, as well as advocates who devote their time, their energy to learning how to reduce and hopefully maybe one day eradicate domestic violence in the Caddo and Bossier Parish. When I took over as president, one of the main focuses is going out and seeking those, especially among males. That's how Mr. Lars and I definitely came in contact. We've known each other for a long time, but I was very, very happy that him, along with his wife, joined my task force. And so everybody that's on my task force, that's what our primary goal is to focus on how do we reduce and eradicate domestic violence incidents, especially ones that end with homicide in our area, because Louisiana overall ranks number 5 in the nation in domestic violence-based homicides towards women. And so we were number 2. In fact, we stayed number 2 all the way up to 2018. And so currently, as of the 2018 statistics, we're number 5. And we don't know yet with COVID whether or not we're going back up into the top 2. It might even edge to 1. There's a lot of work to be done in this state. And so that is why the task force exists. It's been in existence since 2001. And my focus is very much so to make sure that we are touching on those areas, especially the 1 in 4 and the 1 in 7. And with males, I would say this: I'm so glad that this conversation is being had. One of the things that I am going to do is basically step back, because when I was a patrol officer for the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office, and when I worked in Youth Services Division, and then recently I finished with the Caddo District Attorney's Office in their working as an investigator in their Special Victims Unit, one of the things that oftentimes in these incidents of domestic violence is the connection between generation. This becomes a generational issue, because when we get down to why a male would abuse a female, we have to also ask the question, where did this behavior come from? Because this is a transfer of trauma. And most of the time, in most cases, when the question gets asked, because I'll interview the victims, and then sometimes I get a chance to interview the abusers, and the common thread that starts to run is, I learned it from my old man, or as I learned it from an uncle. I grew up and I saw how males treated females. And so for me, that was normalized, or else being in a culture where it was glorified, to have a dominance attitude over the women. and to believe that it was acceptable, because if the woman didn't leave or she came back, this was signaling that, okay, this is okay. And so it's a transferring of trauma. And so when we talk about these conversations, and especially as Mr. Houston, as you put it out there like it needs to be said, we have to understand that the males have to lead and talk to the males. You know, myself, I can talk to them all day long, but the issue I run into is there's going to be a side of me that could take on that mothering role and trying to see how do we, fix this. And oftentimes with the victims in domestic violence, when I'm talking to the victims and I'm asking them, what do you want to see done? Well, I don't want to see him go to jail. I want to see him get some anger management, some counseling, some this. He's a good father. He's a good person. But when he drinks, it's this, or he's been through a lot, or he's lost family. And I've heard the whole gauntlet run on reasonings, and it's always coming from a standpoint, especially with the females, it's that mothering. It is that wanting to replace some type of mothering role and to try to say, okay, I can help him. I know he's got that good side. I can help him. But I also noticed that when in the presence of other males, those are conversations that can be had with other males, that the conversation turns different. The reasoning start to really come out. And so I'm glad that this type of platform is there, because there's only so much I as a female can do when trying to talk to males who have been abusers on how to change their dynamics, and even talking to young men who might be influenced to go down that road. There's only so much that I can do in that role. And so with my task force, especially, we, having males on there helps out, because when we have to go into those spaces, like February, we got teen dating violence coming up. It's my goal to get with some of the school resource officers at some of the schools, and then take some of my male members of the task force to have a forum with just guys and let them have those conversations with those young men, because the younger they are, they tend to open up a lot better about things that are going on, but they have to have the right people in front of them to open up. And I know there are some barriers that's going to naturally sit there because gender differences and so forth. So that's something that I'm learning along the way, navigating with being the leader of the task force.
If Prez, if you will, and you have shared so eloquently, if you just, a lot of times when we have these kinds of forums, people don't like to hear about incidences. And I'm asking you, obviously, I'm not asking you to name a person or a particular situation where someone might know what you're talking about. But of us, and I say those of us, that doesn't include me, might expect when they encounter a domestic situation as a spectator. And I know that's a broad question, but they may be trying to figure out, how should I act, should I interact, etc. What would you say to those persons?
Well, first thing, when you encounter a domestic situation, you are going to realize that you're about to be in for the biggest gaslighting game of your life. You're about to be played some mental gymnastics by the abuser, because especially if you have been put in a position of authority. When I'm deputy sheriff, even though I'm a small frame female, I still had a gun, I still have a badge, I have a level of power that abuser knows that if I get on the scene and I'm like, okay, I'm taking you to jail, if they fight me, I got ways to deal with it. Either way, they're getting in my patrol unit. And so when that abuser is realizing the transfer of power, it is in their best interest to play the game to win. And so there's going to be grooming that is going to be done. They're not going to show the real version of themselves. That is like DV 101. Never will they ever put on the face that they have just put to the person that they battered. And so they're going to be polite. They're going to listen to commands and instructions. They're going to say stories, and they're going to try their best to, try to get in your head and make you try to relate to them. And the biggest issue that I've seen, and I actually saw this when I was reviewing the body cam footage from the young lady Gabby who was killed, when they stopped him, she was hysterical and going through the emotions, which is very common. He was as calm as could be. They let him stay in the car, which was a no-no because he could have grabbed weapons and could have took them all out. It was so many things that they did. And one of the things that just floored me was at the end, the patrol officer who was on the scene, when he got back in his unit, he still had his mic pack active, and he starts talking about his relationship with his, wife, and I can understand and all that different stuff. I was like, you just got played, right? You got played from start to finish. It's a huge gaslighting game that you're going to go through, and you have to be on high alert. You cannot drop your guard. I don't care if if you know them, so what? You know a side of them. Get on that scene and find out who is the dominant aggressor. Look for the clues that let you know who did it. So.
And I want you to share that because of so many conversations. And I know, Brother Houston, you know all of this, but I'm just saying there are so many people that don't get what has just been stated. And I'm telling you, it was personal for me. I'm happy that you're saying this openly. Is that there's so many people we've encountered that don't seem to get it. Oh, you just don't understand, and you don't know what you're talking about, and that's not that person, and that kind of thing. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Now, Shatranjan, our
Yes.
guests don't know this. However, you are Mr. Greer Travis. And because you are a former student, they have to forgive me for calling you Shatranjan.
First, I'd like to say thank you, Mr. Lars, for the invitation. What an honor and privilege to share this platform with these amazing people. And I'd like to thank everyone for the work that you have done and continue to do for this very grave problem that is a problem, the domestic violence. I'm a former Detroit police officer. I served about 5 years on the west side of Detroit, working at the 8th Precinct, which is the largest precinct in the city of Detroit, and probably one of the most violent. It encompasses a neighborhood called Brightmoor. And, outside of the east side of the city, Brightmoor on the west side of the city is probably one of the busiest. So the 8th Precinct and the 9th Precinct. 9th Precinct is on the east side. So prior to coming back to school and working on my doctorate, I did that. And I want to say that there are 3 things that I dealt with on a nightly basis. And I think many of them systemic, but for sure, the main 3 reasons behind a lot of my calls were poverty, drug abuse, and mental health on a nightly basis. Now, domestic violence is no surprise. That was my #1 police call for service. I looked up the domestic violence. We have a unit at Detroit Police Department called, we have a DV unit. So a lot of times I respond to a call and I'm the initial officer, and then I make a call whether or not there's probable cause to make an arrest. Thankfully, the domestic laws in the state of Michigan have changed. It says that there's no discretion any longer. Back in the day, they would just say, hey, is there some place I can take you? Can you leave for the night type of thing? No, that's out of the window. You take the primary aggressor. There's probable cause that that any form of domestic violence took place, you take the aggressor. I will say that is very true. That a lot of times, if the suspect is still on scene, you get there, they're going to be the nicest person in the world, and in fact, you can tell just how manipulative they are, because they will, if you allow them to try to also run game on you too. And I've seen the full gamut of that, but it's so interesting. Not at one point in time did any of them challenge me as a police officer. So
Well, Dr. Greer, if I might say, heck, you're about 6'3", about 275 solid pounds. So there may be, you have to be kind of dumb but go ahead.
My partner and I, my partner was about the same size. So we show up to the door like, But anyway, the interesting thing about that is that there was it's like in their mind, they hadn't done anything wrong. That is normalized to the point where, hey, this is what we do. That famous saying, hurt people. So the psychology behind it is an interesting thing in and of itself. The systemic bit of it is interesting in and of itself. I have a few statistics. Now, I don't know how accurate these are because I don't know, they can fudge some things with numbers, but I looked at these and these are striking. All right. So they have a range from 2018 to 2020, and this is taken from the DetroitMichigan.gov sites, where they're reporting the incidences of domestic violence. And this is directly from the DV unit, year-to-date assignments. So these are the cases that have been assigned citywide. Now, this is just in the city of Detroit. 2020, now mind you, we had the pandemic. There were 787 domestic violence assignments. So an investigator, they were responding to 787 felony cases, 2,861 misdemeanor cases, for a total of 3,648 cases for that year, the year 2020. And the year prior, 2019, and these are just reported from January to May, there were 3,871. Those numbers, I mean, you consider there being 365 days a year, I mean, you'll see, like, we're busy answering domestic violence calls, and those are just the reported cases. So, the prevalence of this as an issue, it just, the numbers are through the roof, as you've heard. I bear witness to the damage. I saw a lot of violence in the city of Detroit, but that call, when you get that domestic call, I mean, that's probably outside of driving the scout car, that's probably one of the most dangerous things you can do as a police officer. But that's what I did all day, every day. I knew for sure I was going to get at least one domestic violence arrest per night. Usually, I was just one unit. We had at least one domestic violence arrest, and that was like a night. That was the number one thing that I took people to jail for. Number one, you didn't have any discretion. Number two, and then you go back to the same house night after night after night. Even though we worked in the largest precinct, I dealt with a lot of the same individuals. So that's just my general remarks about domestic violence. That it's the aftermath of it is oftentimes devastating, and a lot of times the end result is death.
And I know that can be pretty devastating. And to ask you and Dr. Pierre Davis, how, in your opinion, as being officers of the law, former officers of the law, how does that make our judicial system appear to you as a person that worked within the system. I mean, if I answered that question myself as an outsider, it wouldn't be very flattering, and I'll be very blunt about that.
Dr. Pierre?
Oh, okay. So this is going to be an interesting answer. It exposes some extreme cracks in the judicial system. Okay. Every time we're dealing with a domestic violence homicide, it's going to expose some extreme cracks in the judicial system. I'll take, for example, Louisiana. Okay, we have a set of laws now in place called Gwynn's Laws. Gwynn's Laws has only been in existence since I think about 2014, 2015, because that was the year that Gwen Sally was killed by her estranged husband. Okay. The issue was up until that point, Louisiana operated up under terms of cool down periods. Then they will set an automatic bond that was set at a certain price and then bond out. The victims were at a point where all they had to do was say they wanted to drop the charges, sign an affidavit, and that was it. It took her death and it took to push some legislation to change the domestic violence laws in the state and how the judicial system starts to handle these abusers. But even then, there was pushback coming out the gate from judges, from lobbyists who were like, this is impinging on Second Amendment rights. This is, I mean, it has been a battle just trying to set forth some laws that can catch up with the nature of the violence, because we're talking about destroying families. If we care about families, then we have to really, really get some strong sentencing guidelines. We have to do a lot of work. And so every time that we have a homicide that's the result of domestic violence, it has once again exposed the cracks in the system. Protection orders, main one. Oh, it's just a piece of paper. And unfortunately, it has for years just been a piece of paper. Now we get to the point where we put ankle monitors on them and put addresses and everything to try to put some bite behind that paper. And we've also added the third party clause where you cannot get family members, church members, whoever to contact the victim. But it always is a reaction, and it takes a tragedy to push it forward. We have not yet reached the point where our elected officials will go down to the state capitol for the states and say, we just going to go ahead and make this a law. We're not going to wait for a dead body to be shamed into doing it. And it's just, we keep exposing more cracks every time that there is a domestic violence homicide. It takes us right back to square one, like, okay, now what do we do? You know, especially social media. We now have domestic violence incidents where they literally will kill the victim on social media. That was a new ground. And I mean, it happened right here in this state, right in my state. And so I'm like, we're always going back to drawing board, but it takes a dead body in order for something to push forward. And if we're going to be family oriented, and we say that we're about families, then we need to recognize this is the number one thing that's going to tear a family apart for good. And it's not going to be fixed overnight or in the next generation, to be honest with you. So.
Dr. Travis Greer?
You know, I think about the process with no victim, or a lot of times, like, so the investigators will contact the victim, and a lot of times the victim will know, or they're so afraid they'll no case it, and it's mind-boggling, right? So because you can't prosecute with no victim. I mean, and And a lot of times the offender knows that, or the suspect, I should say, they know that all that they have to do is like, how, if there's no victim, they're not going to prosecute. Now for felony cases, they try and do a little bit more, but it's kind of the same thing. Any other homicide, in the neighborhood, you'll have people who don't come forth, and they might have been right there. They might have been an eyewitness. They don't cooperate with the system. And so what happens is you have this endless cycle of violence because people have lost faith in this system, right? So a lot of times the cousins, uncles, brothers, or whatever will do their own kind of street justice. And then we have to respond to that as well. But I can say in general that the faith in these neighborhoods in what we were doing and in terms of us, in terms of them knowing that they're going to get some form of justice for whatever happened to them, they kind of had no faith in the police. And that was disheartening. I would hear it night after night after night, like, man, you all coming, it's too late. Like, why is it that you all, and it broke my heart because I saw myself in the face of the people that I served. Like I grew up in the city. I'm a Detroit boy, born and raised. East side of Detroit, and so the people, I saw myself in them, and hopefully they could see themselves in me. Well, a lot of times, that was the hope anyway, but they didn't really see themselves in me. They saw me as being a part of the problem, not the solution. Like, oh, you're here, but you're not going to do nothing. So that was a tough pill to swallow.
And that is why I wanted to ask for our audience, with those of you that actually work in law enforcement, because some of those are always questions that come across. Those are statements that we hear, and so thank you guys for sharing that. Dr. Burton, will you share with us a little bit, please, sir, about who you are, what you do, and if you share with us a little bit from a clergy point of view as to the domestic violence and things that we might do or can share.
All right. Thank you, Melvin. Well, most of my adult life, I've been for the last 40 years in the ministry of some form and fashion, running rehab centers, but mostly in local churches, working with drug addicts and alcoholics. And it's obvious that where there's drugs and alcohol, there's going to be domestic abuse. We also have women that come to our groups that are the victims, like the officer was talking about. And the victims many times are afraid and they find it difficult to get out of their situation. The women typically don't have a place to go sometimes. They don't have the money to get out of their situation. And so it is a very complex issue. I've changed my focus, as you know, in the last few years, for focusing on this is a cultural thing, and the younger age that we can start with, that's the way we'll turn it around. As the doctor said, it's going to take generations to change this. Well, how do we do that? Well, during the children's formative years is the best chance that we have to change that. And so my emphasis has changed, even though I'm in the last chapter of my life. My emphasis has been on how can we minimize the number of kids that experiment with drugs and alcohol, because a percentage of those are going to become addicts. And then when they become addicts, they're going to become abusers. And then I really appreciate what Ricky said about the manhood thing. If he can repeat that, if he can get that where it can be repeated in our churches, in our schools, we can change the generation. We may not live long enough to see it, but that's where it's going to begin, and that's where we have to start. So, I'm aware of it. We try to teach women what to do. how to be prepared to get out of their situation, how to help them move. Even sometimes we send them to places, help them with expenses. But so many of them also as victims have kind of joined up with a man they're going to try to fix. And so even when they get out of that situation, they feel guilty. They feel like they've got to go back in, try it again to fix them. And that's the reason it goes on for so long. As the doctor talked about, that motherhood thing, they think they've got to go back and repair that man, and they can do it. And so, and then there's a mix of these children that are all mixed up in this. I don't know what the percentage is, but when kids see their fathers abuse their mothers, then many times they become abusers, just in all issues. And so it's a very complex situation. I wish I had some more answers. I just know where I'm putting my energy, as you know, Melvin.
Right. But as you share that, many times, having been a pastor for as a number of years, when you have to counsel individuals that have been engulfed in domestic violence, do you find it difficult to counsel them when they are giving you pushback, or do you find it just difficult in general because of the sanctity of the church? And don't answer this if you don't want to, but I just I always think about that because and I'm asking this question because so many times we hear either personally or we hear people say, as you know, we're in the ministry as well. My pastor said I should just, trust God and hang in there and this, that, and the third, while they're getting their brains beaten out, and God forbid, some of them have been murdered. So, from a clergy point of view, when you have you been confronted, and if I can use that word, confronted with parishioners maybe that have been dealing with domestic violence issues, do you find it difficult to work with those families, or do you get a lot of pushback?
Well, yeah, you normally get some pushback, but my wife and I both counsel, yeah, you can trust God, but trust God while you're packing your bags, because a woman being abused should never stay in a situation. And if she can temporarily get out of it and see if her husband or her man gets some help, then there's a possibility of restoration. And that's what God's about. God's always about restoration, but it takes a change to create restoration. And if people are not willing to go get the help that they need, you can't restore. You can't unscramble scrambled eggs. That's just the way it is. And if they won't go get some help, then that woman has to put herself, I believe, in a safe position. As all of us are, we hate divorce. We hate to see our kids go through it. But which is the worst? Kids watching a woman being abused, or a woman getting out of situations where she can protect herself and her kids? We advise them, to get in a place of safety, and then over time we'll tell if there's any chance of restoration.
Thank you for that,
brother.
brother.
Yeah,
Jump right in.
So just wanted, and I appreciate what the pastor was saying there. Myself, I'm a pastor within my city as well, and I've done several workshops with churches, and I actually work with congregations to develop policies as well. And I so totally agree with them. I had a pastor ask me one night, when is it okay to tell her she can go back? And I said, well, that's not your decision. That's hers. Because when you think about repentance, it's and restoration, there has to be an internal change. And so if it took 10 years for him to be that person that he wasn't, I don't know how long it's going to take for him to prove that there is a change there. And so I'm with Pastor. I'm never going to advise someone to go back, because we're looking at safety. I was in the middle of teaching a class one night, and it dawned on me, and I thought about my son when he was, when he was smaller, and he would break a toy, and he would bring that toy to me and say, "Fix it, Daddy, fix it." And he said, "You can fix it." And all of a sudden, I've become like that super dad because I'm trying to fix this toy because I want to have that that cape on my back. And it dawned on me was, even though my son broke the toy, he liked the toy, he loved the toy, he didn't want to discard the toy, but he wanted dad to fix the toy. And so when we think about, and it made me think about domestic violence relationships sometimes, because when that relationship first started, there's, he never walks in and say, "Hey, I'm gonna give you the best 6 months of your life." Then all of a sudden things are going, and I'm gonna start doing this. And by the time we get into the full year, I'm gonna be abusing you, because no one will sign up for that. But what happens is that, they kind of get lured into that. And I was listening to police officers really talking about how that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, he'll show you a totally different person when they show up on the scene. And when we're looking at that, oftentimes, and I see oftentimes where there are a lot of victims who they don't want to discard him, but can somebody fix him? And I go back with Pastor there, is that's why the prevention programs, from kids on up, doing this work at the very beginning. There's some curriculums that we've used before. One is Hands Are Not for Hitting. It's normally for like kindergartners and first grade, about good things to do with your hands. Another one called Words Are Not for Hurting, because we only think about the physical abuse, but look at the damage that words are causing. Because when we think about words that are dehumanizing, words that are degrading, that really, that turns into psychological abuse. And we also know the mental abuse. And so when we start reaching kids at a very early age, we've got a curriculum at a call to men called Live Respect, where we reach middle schoolers and high schoolers as well, as we talk about healthy manhood, what healthy manhood should look like. Because what we do know is that, as I was saying earlier, as I think about that little boy who's getting his shots, this begins at a very early age. And so we can begin to show some things and some different things. And also listen to you talk about, some of the laws and some of the policies. We've had a bad history of, and why it's so important to engage men. We've had a bad history of collusion. Bad history of collusion, where we've looked out for one another. And I listened to the officer say, back in the day, it used to be taking him around the block, dropping back off. And I heard you talking about, having the hot mic on in the car, talking about his own relationship. So how often, how many times, and sometimes when we think about victims, especially women, not really trusting that, that judicial system because of what happened to someone else. And so rebuilding that trust, that's why prevention is so key. And that's why we believe in engaging, boys at a very early age. Not only boys, but also engaging girls as well. I'm blessed to have two, a son and a daughter. They're adults now. But what I understood was that how I treated my wife wasn't only for my son, but it was for my daughter as well. Because she needed to see how she should be respected as a woman as well. Because I've done too much work in schools where I hear, girls say, "Well, you should expect, some abuse in a relationship." And see, and that comes from what the pastor was saying. It's been normalized what they've seen at home. So that's why it's so key, to have prevention programs. Our youth director at church, talked about, for teenagers, there's a safe dates curriculum. So doing some of these curriculums, bring it within our faith communities. So many times I would have different women groups from churches that will call up and say, "Hey, can you talk with our pastor about you coming to do a workshop at our church?" They didn't feel comfortable enough asking their pastor. And I'm like, wow. And that's a problem there, because if we haven't talked about it as clergy, if we haven't talked about it from the pulpit, then it hasn't become important. But when we begin to talk about it from the pulpit, begin to put in programming and different things, that's when it becomes important. That's when the phone will begin to ring, more knocks happen at the door. But also, some of those men who are abusers, they're sitting in our congregation. I look at my congregation. If I look at every 1 in 4, if I have victims sitting in my congregation, I have abusers in my congregation. And sometimes they wear a collar like me. Sometimes it's the CEO of the company in town. And so when we think about this, it doesn't matter what side of town that you live on, how much money you do or you don't make. It's impacting so many communities. And so that's why it's so important, for the prevention work to begin at a very early age so we can eradicate this.
Well, all these things are so very powerful. Guys, if I might share as we move forward, and I think I share with all of you at one point or the other, is I focus a lot also on as we talk about the books that are out there. But Brother Houston, as you talk about your son and the toy that's broken, that he brings it to you and asks you to fix it, then you have those children, I being one of them, who are so embroiled in a family where domestic violence is commonplace until you get to a point where you feel like the only person that can fix it is you. And unfortunately, fixing it might mean the taking of a life. And I tell people this all the time, is that I don't say it to be proud of it. Thank God I did not have to take a life. And my beautiful mother that you see sitting behind me, I was afraid that she might lose her life because of the severity. I've seen her with ribs broken, have to have stitches in parts of her body, hiding, that kind of thing. And as the son, we all feel like we have to be protectors. Now, as we talk about caveats, let me tell you what was a tough dilemma to go with that. It was a stepfather, but he wasn't abusive to me. There's so many stories out there about how the step parents treat you and how mean they are and how nasty they are. But he was never, from a little boy, grown up to try to be a big man. He was never abusive to me like the horror stories I've heard of young men having stepdads, but he was abusive to my mother. And so it was a dilemma for me, is that I did not want to hurt him, but I was not going to allow him to continue to hurt my mother until the showdown finally came. About my 14th birthday, the showdown finally came. And quite frankly, it was very uneventful for me, because I'm ready to do this dude, man. I'm ready to take care of him. And he stays behind my mother. He doesn't even attempt to, quote, put me in my place as a quote child or whatever. My mother, again, being the nurturer, she did all the confronting me. Go sit down, be quiet. You know better than that. You don't talk to grown people. Blah 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 blah. And then so I, in turn, as a son, become angry. Of course, never saying anything to her. Is that because I felt like she was defending him. And many times when we talk to our young people, I make a point of trying to share that with them as well, is not to confuse the fact that mom is trying to protect everybody and that she is the nurturer, as all of you have shared. So I share my story because I want young people to understand that there may be times that you are put in positions where you feel as though you have to be the savior, so to speak. And unfortunately, I have a friend lives in Detroit still, Shatranton. He's from New York, who actually watched his father murder not only his mom but his sister. The mom and the sister was in the bed, and he shoots the mom and the sister, and shoots the mom in the head 3 times. So, and being around other people and and I must share this as well, having a friend who's, and I'm just going to call it because the truth needs to be out there as we talk about men making the difference and how manipulative they are. A friend who's passed on now, and I happen to be his daughter's godfather, was abusing his wife. And she kept telling me, and I said, not him. I said, because we talk about that all the time and this, that, and the third. And roll up one day, guys, waiting to visit them and the godchild and witness this atrocity. Now, needless to say, and I'm not proud of this, but that was not a proud moment because I had no business putting hands on it. I did not, because I'm not the law. But so as you share the things that you're sharing, and I want our audience to understand, is that there are so many situations that we have to be cognizant of. And Pastor Houston, as I'm hearing you share, and I'm hearing the clergy and the officers share, is that you are opening so many eyes. Believe me, you're opening so many eyes, and that's what we need to have open, and we need to have our men to get on board. So I ask this question: when we discuss having our men get on board, what can anyone share some suggestions before we go as to how we might best do that, how we might best convince those of us that do understand that our women are not to be punching bags, that they are not to be receivers of our wrath. How do we best get them to understand that and to get them to be a part of this? And I'll call it a movement of this movement, referring back to what Pastor Houston said about the man box and coming out of that man box.
One of the things we say at a call to men, we like to meet men where they are. And there are men on the spectrum who are like on this call, who are doing this work. And I always like to say the biggest room in my house is room for improvement. So I know that there's always space for me to grow every day. So as the Bible says, that iron sharpens iron. So we get a chance to learn from each other. But also there are men out there, when I say there's a small portion of men who abuse, but then there's the rest of us. We got to engage those men there, because those are the men who and give them the tools, begin to have these conversations, because those are some of the boys who grew up and saw mom being abused, who know that it's not good behavior. They want to get involved. It's just they don't have that mentor or don't have the tools in order to get involved. We also, because once we do that, get them to develop that interest, and not only that, but have these conversations with men to move us to the place where we begin to open up about some of those past hurts and some of those past pains, because it was hurtful. And sometimes there was a video I read from the Family Prevention Fund, or assault. It's about 15 years ago, but it says something my father would do. And in that, there was about a story of 3 young men, and 2 of them who said they would never become that guy became that guy, but 1 who didn't. And so how do we begin to have these conversations, begin to meet men where they are? Because it's that when working with men who have abused, number 1 is how do we work with them, but also hold them accountable at the same time. And so I think that's the work that we have to do in order to cause that shift. As I said about that dad taking his son to get his vaccine, beginning to cause that shift, because once we can educate them, then that's how we'll start that spectrum. And the next thing too is we've got to also come together, even with our school systems, to talk about how do we put these prevention programs within the school system. How do we make way for that? And I'm not talking about adding another subject on for a teacher who is already there, but maybe bring that in, make that's someone's job, to do that type work, because we've got to begin to educate kids at a very early age, because they're seeing it at home. So we just can't do it one time a year, because they're seeing it all the time at home. So we've got to continue to reinforce, this whole message. I do a group called Circle of Influence for adult males. It's a 10-week group. And one of the challenges, and I'm talking about men, sometime in my group who are 30s, 40s, and 50s, who say, hey, this is great stuff. But one of the biggest challenge for me is going back and having this conversation with my father, because how it was normalized for them, how they grew up, really seeing this shift. And so we've got to really create more spaces like you have here, so we can begin to have these conversations. And I said earlier, not indicting them, but inviting men to have these conversations so that we can begin to educate men. Because if we educate men, give them that knowledge, hopefully we will change that belief system. And if we can change that belief system, then in changing that attitude, then we can change actions. And so that's what I look to do.
If I may, just a quick reflection on my family and my
Please.
Okay. So, I don't know if any the Jennifer Hudson and that movie with Aretha Franklin, some of these ideas came up in this too, in that movie, with the late Reverend C.L. Franklin, moving to Detroit. Well, interestingly enough, that's how my great-grandfather was from Birmingham, Alabama, and all of my family, they came up to Detroit. Now, most of the time you think Black folk came up north, post-industrial revolution to get the job at the factories. Well, in my family, it was my great-grandfather running from the law. He beat my great grandmother almost to her death, left her for dead. And so he was running from the law. He hopped on the train, made his way to Detroit. And eventually his children moved to Detroit. So my family came. So it was so normalized back in the, what was this, maybe early 1900s, 1915, 20, So he comes to Detroit. I think he ended up coming to Detroit in the 40s. Yeah, that's right. They said he came. So my family moved to Detroit in the 40s. This stopping the cycle, because my mom had 7 siblings, and just about all of them were in domestic violence relationships, including my grandmother. So, great grandfather, great grandmother, grandmother, grandfather, right? And then, so this is relatively recent in my family line. Like, it kind of stopped with me. And you want to know how it stopped? My mom marrying my dad, who is an amazing man. I'm sorry. My father's an amazing man who was like the epitome of, he was a very good role model for me. But from a very early age, my mom, she trained my brother and I, you do not hit girls. You do not hit girls. You do not put your hands on girls, right? And this was like, and I always wonder, like, man, why is my mom always saying, don't hit girls, don't do that? Because of, she grew up in the Brewster Projects in Detroit, seeing her older sisters get beat up by their spouse. And, she put an end to it with my brother and I from an early age. And not only that, marrying my dad, who also role modeled to my brother and I what manhood is like. We have to be the change that we want to see. And as a man, I feel like it's my responsibility because there is a thing is like, patriarchy and, male privilege and things like that. I think it's if you're somehow, implicit in the wrongs that are done in society due to how you are, your gender, then what you have to do is be that change and work for change. So be the change on a personal level, but that's not enough just to be a good or work to be a good person, but to also advocate for victims of domestic violence or women who are victims of domestic violence.
I would like to add, as a female, one of the things that I said that also helps is a lot of times from my experience of investigating DV cases, there's always a support system that does include other females. And that's something that has to also be addressed too, is that if you are a female out there and you're helping to push along violence and encourage violence towards other females, you need to stop and kind of back up and ask yourself, where are you in this cycle? Because it's something that's considered what is called benevolent patriarchy, the thought process or the good girl mindset of, if I just play to the role and appease the behaviors of males, and not good males. That's the crazy part about it. It's not supporting the good men like on this thing. It's supporting the guys who are out there doing this type of behavior and finding reasons to support that. I mean, one of the things that I say is there has to be also discussion with those females who say, oh, there's nothing wrong with, every now and then getting slapped around and all that different stuff. I went through it, or else I know this and everything like that. Those females has to be educated too. And a lot of times, unfortunately, they're not going to listen to other females because they have been engulfed with a mindset to compete with other females, the good girl mindset. And so it takes educating from, they learn from males talking to them. And they will learn, it's like, no, don't encourage that behavior from him. Don't do it. If a man saying that to females that enable these type of that play into this role, into this world, it comes off a lot stronger than if they're listening to other females, because we do have, unfortunately, like Mr. Houston was saying, that small portion, we do have a small portion of females who they play their role in continuously pushing those numbers. And so with that group, you have to send a male to talk to them, because us females have tried to talk to them and they look upon us as if we're wasting our time, no, because of whatever mindset they got. But that's something that also don't always get put out there. But I have learned along the way, if he is abusing another woman, he's got a woman who's also assisting him, whether it's his mother, a aunt, another family member, a ex who he groomed to be his support. He's got a female in the group as well as other males. So you have to also deal with that female too. And a lot of times females who think like that, they only respond when a male is talking to them about those type of behaviors.
Wow. Now that, along with everything else, is a mouth and an earful. Please allow me to say that this has been most, if I can say, intriguing and enjoyable and insightful, because we have been getting thumbs up going all over the place here. So allow me to say to each and every one of you that has been an absolute pleasure sharing and hearing from you. Hopefully, we will be able to do this format along with many others again. And if you have any closing statements, please share them at this time. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, listen, it's been great. We're proud and pleased to have you here again. Allow us to thank us being Brighter Futures Incorporated 91 and the Caddo Bossier Domestic Violence Task Force, along with our president, Dr. Latienda Pierre Davis. And we want to send a special thank you to Pastor Ricky Houston of South Carolina, Pastor, or North Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. And the gratitude along with our other panelists. We know that everybody's time is extremely important, and we thank you for taking the time. We just simply want to encourage everyone to understand that this domestic terrorism is alive and it's well. And you've heard everyone talk about one simple thing, is that it takes all of us to help to eradicate and at least reduce this entire problem that we have called domestic violence. And couldn't have been closed any better with our president, as she talked about how ladies, unfortunately, help the situation to continue because they encourage. May not be intentional, but they encourage. So we just want to put that message out there for everyone. So again, it's been great. We thank you so very much for being here with us, and we thank our great audience. And I'm just so pleased that you guys were so thoroughly educated until you had no questions. So thank you so very much. And we want everyone to have a great and blessed day.